Hi, I'm Daniel Gregory. Thanks so much for joining me for my class on the magic of profiles and how to create your own profiles. And if you're not sure what a profile is, we're going to make sure that's covered as well. I hope you're enjoying the conference so far. I know for me, it's been amazing to watch some of the great classes and great instructors presenting some content. I know I've learned a lot of new things about Lightroom. So even though I've been in it for years and I've been teaching Lightroom for years, there's been so many great and interesting tips and tricks throughout the summit. So hopefully you're getting a lot of content and new things to try and to make your photography that much better. Today, I wanted to talk, like I said, about profiles. And if you've never really thought much about profiles, they have impacted your photography from the very beginning. Because the way your camera works, it requires a profile. It's one of the really kind of odd things. We don't really talk about it a lot, but it's always kind of hidden there. And the reason for that is the way your camera works. When your camera records an actual image, it creates a RAW file. And even if you're shooting a JPEG, it still creates a RAW file at the very beginning to then convert into that JPEG. That RAW file itself doesn't contain any real color information. It only contains the luminance values of the various pixels. And because of that, what we end up with is analogous to, say, a film negative. So there's no real detail there. There's no real information there. We have to actually turn that into a photograph. The way that is done is through the use of a profile. So inside your camera are camera profiles, and that's what sets the aesthetic and look for the photograph. Because what the profile does is it defines how color is used, it defines a white point, it sets saturation, and it makes that decision for how should that photograph look. And if you've ever dived into the back of your camera at all and set some settings, you might see an option there to set the color space for sRGB or Adobe RGB. That doesn't impact the RAW file in the least bit, but it does impact the JPEG, and it defines the color space for the JPEG that would be created. And that JPEG, even if you're only shooting RAW, is the thing that appears on the back of your camera's LCD. That little LCD picture is a JPEG of your photograph. Also in your camera are settings that you may or may not use, but I know a lot of people do, and I use them myself because I kind of like to look at that JPEG on the back of the camera and see what the aesthetic looks like. You might use camera vivid or camera flat or camera portrait or landscape. There's these little settings that let you change the look of the images that appear out of your camera. And if you're a Fuji shooter, maybe you have film simulations. Maybe you like the look of the Velvia film simulation, or you like the look of the Provia film simulation. That simulation or that aesthetic is also a profile. So you've always used profiles, you maybe just weren't aware of that. Now, the reason the profile is so interesting when we move into editing behind the computer and we move into a program like Lightroom, or we move into Camera Raw, or even if you're using Capture One or On One or one of these other tools that can read a RAW file, is that raw data comes in, and again, it needs a wrapper put around it that defines how that's going to look. That is also a profile. And in the Adobe world, and in the Lightroom world, those profiles were called DCPs, which stood for a digital negative camera profile. And Adobe went and looked at that raw data, and they would build a profile based on the camera and the camera manufacturer, and in some cases, those individual settings that you may have had in the camera, like flat, landscape, vivid, portrait, Velvia. And Adobe would make a digital camera profile so that when the raw file came in, you could use Adobe Standard, or you could select and use one of the camera profiles that Adobe had created. But those DCP files were the wrapper by which color was defined, contrast was defined, and the white point was defined. It was the starting point. So how do I think about these profiles? Well, I think about them as the foundation of the house for the image you're editing. So imagine you're building a house. You've got walls, you've got a roof, you've got windows, you've got paint, you've got siding, you've got all these different things that go into making the house. Well, all of that stuff sits on the foundation of that house. A bad foundation results in a crumbling, falling down house. A good foundation gives you the strength and flexibility to grow and build what you want on top of that foundation. So profiles are that foundation. And if you can remember that analogy, it's going to help you understand how to apply profiles into your workflow and what they do to your image before you actually start editing. Now, one of the great things that happened in Lightroom version 7.3 for Classic and version 1.3 for Lightroom CC and version 10.3 for Camera Raw, is we got enhanced profiles. So a little bit nerdy here, but the enhanced profile said if I have this DCP file, I could put something on top of that. I could basically, add a little bit of seasoning to that. And the enhanced profile allowed me to add things like a 3D color lookup table or a LUT. It allowed me to shift tonal values and contrast in a way that I didn't have before. So now I could start to create profiles and have artistic profiles or film simulation profiles, or I could create a certain look that I wanted for, say, maybe a historical process. Maybe you want to make cyanotype looking images. Or maybe you're trying to get your Instagram work and your Lightroom work to look similar. You could create a profile that would allow that simulation to happen there as well. So these enhanced profiles really gave us a lot of creative flexibility for how we built that foundation. Now, in that foundation is one of the most, I think, critical things to that enhanced profile. And it's really, when I think of the profile, what I think of is the core part of the profile. And that's the lookup table. And when I talk about the lookup table, there's two types. The first lookup table is how is color defined. So that might be Adobe Color or Adobe Standard or Adobe Vivid. That's the base foundation of that DCP file of how color is created. Then we have a color lookup table. And when we say color lookup table, that's usually when people say a LUT. That's what they're referring to, is the 3D lookup table. And a 3D LUT or a color LUT allows us to take the specific value of one RGB color and change it into another color by reassigning those numeric values. So we create a mapping between those. So we could in fact take blues and turn them teal, or we could take reds and turn them slightly orange. We literally, at that foundational level, we reassign how those colors are applied. So a lot of the times, enhanced profiles, I think of those as LUTs. Now in the cinematic world, we referred to a LUT or a lookup table. That was what caused color grading. So if you've watched movies that have had a certain saturation level or a change of color, you'll have noticed that they actually have a color grading applied. We recently got color grading in Lightroom as the split toning panel was updated to include color grading. But a lookup table, a color lookup table, gives us a lot more flexibility and a lot more control about how those colors change. And so that's one of the really exciting things about those enhanced profiles. So that's a little background about profiles, kind of the history of them and where they come from and why they're so important, again, to building the foundation of our house that we're going to work with. Now, where do profiles live? Well, if you were in the old version of Lightroom, they used to live under the calibration panel. And you would go down there and you would see either Adobe Standard or you would see some of the other DCP files that Adobe had created for your camera type. But since version 7.3/1.3 in Lightroom, they've been moved up to where I think is the most appropriate place in the workflow and within the application. If we jump here into Lightroom, if we go into the basic panel, up here at the top, we have the decision of color or black and white. Now that's a foundational question we're asking about how we edit our images. Do I want color or black and white? And once I make that decision, down below is profiles. So the profile is where we would select the profile. In this case, you can see this particular image is got the profile Adobe Standard V2 applied. If I click in that little profile pull-down menu, you can see there's other options. So there's Adobe Color, there's Adobe Landscape, and you can see my image on screen changes pretty dramatically just by changing that profile. And we'll get into really what's going on behind the scenes here in a second. This button over here activates the profile browser, which lets me then see all of the profiles that I might have installed and in some cases adjust the strength of that profile. I can also get to the profile browser by clicking on the browse button here. Same thing. Now, if I jump over into Lightroom CC, at the top of the edit stack, so if I activate my edit tool, there's my little puppy dog Cora. We're going to be using her as our demo in Lightroom CC. At the top of the edit stack is the option for profiles. And you can see here's the profile browser. And you can see there's basic, artistic, some of the same pieces we might see in the in Lightroom Classic. However, you'll notice that if I go to the basic panel here, I only have the option for color and monochrome. And this is one of the interesting things about profiles and the way profiles are created. Basic profiles, those DC profiles, this image is a JPEG, so it's not a RAW file. That means it doesn't have any of that RAW file data for the profile to interact with. It's lacking a DCP file because it's not a RAW file. So sometimes when you click on an image, you may notice, whether you're in Lightroom CC or in Lightroom Classic, that some of your profiles are gone or they seem to be missing. And that's because that profile isn't designed to work with the file type you're in. Now, when we get to creating profiles, I'm going to show you where that's set and how that gets applied. But you haven't done anything wrong, and Lightroom's not broken. It's just that the file type you're on, JPEG or RAW file or TIFF file, Photoshop file, they just don't support that particular profile type. That's just something to be aware of. Okay, let's jump back into Lightroom Classic here. We're going to dive a little bit more into these profiles and kind of how they work and why I think it's so important that, again, like building a house, you don't build the roof first and then put the foundation in underneath it. You build the foundation first. If I come in here and I select profiles, I'm going to go ahead and click on the Browse panel. I'm just going to activate my profiles. And initially, I'm just going to look up here just at the Adobe standard profiles. So if I mouse over these, what's cool is I see a real-time rendering of that profile and its effect on my image. Now you can see that the saturation changes, the black point changes, the luminosity changes based on which profile I choose. And that's because, again, that raw file's data can be interpreted all sorts of different ways. It's part of the amazing thing about working with a raw file is we can reinterpret that data over and over and over again and change that aesthetic and that look. It's also one of the great things about future-proofing files is that raw data lets us make changes down the road for software that's potentially not even written yet or even conceived of being written yet. So it's a really kind of cool opportunity. But you can see in here, if I chose Adobe Neutral and then I chose Adobe Landscape, I would make different decisions about saturation, vibrance, and luminosity in the basic panel, tone curve, and HSL because I already have a color boost here. This is the foundational way those pixels were interpreted. So it's a cool spot of saying, wow, this is already closer to what I want. This is closer to the architecture I wanted for the house I'm building. This blueprint is way more accurate than what I would have had if I had started here. This requires a lot of remodeling, a lot of expense. If you've ever built a house, remodeling, changing plans after the fact, really expensive. But if you can make that decision early on in the blueprint phase, at that earliest stage, it's cheaper. So again, which one of these is closer to my interpretation? Now, the other thing that's kind of cool about profiles is I'm going to go here and let's just collapse all of these. You can see I've got a bunch of different options for profiles. I've got camera matching here. So these are DCP files that have been created to simulate what my camera would have done. So this was taken on a D700. So here you can see again, these are simulating what would have happened in the camera had I changed the settings in the camera. There's some of the monochrome options that exist within that camera. And you can see there's some really pretty good swings in how those colors would be presented and how that information would be presented. Now, if we go down a little farther here, you can see I've also got artistic choices. So these are artistic 1, 2, and you can see we start to get some interesting color changes in here. You know, if I go into that artistic 7, you can see that's really warmed the image up. If I come down here into modern, you can see the same thing. I end up with some pretty crazy color changes. Look at the difference in the blue in the sky there. Now, this is one of the areas where I just wanted to touch base about profiles because I think there's several camps on how we approach profiles. There are people who are, let's just call them a little snobby about profiles. They think of them as these Instagram filters that get applied to an image. And then there are people who love the fact that they can have this creative control on how they might approach the photograph. And then there's people who just kind of don't care. They're sort of in the middle. I think one of the things that's the most important about photography is that we create images that matter to us, that speak to us. They are meaningful to us. And software is a tool to help us achieve that. So in the old days, for those of you who shot film, I was a film shooter, I'm still a film shooter. Every film had a different look and a different aesthetic. If you chose Kodachrome or Velvia or Provia or Ektachrome, each one of those films created a different look. They created a different aesthetic. They created a different sensibility of how we would read the photograph. That is the equivalent of a profile. We are changing how color and luminosity and saturation come together with contrast and tonal values to create the look of the image we want. And I would choose a film based on that interpretation. Profile, again, while I said it's foundational, it's choosing the film stock. If I wanted this warmer color, this cooler color, if I wanted greens and reds to be more saturated, I would choose a film stock that did that. And so I don't think it's necessarily negative to use profiles. I don't think it's the same thing as just clicking on things at random, because you're making a decision early in your workflow about how did you imagine that photograph looking. Now, if you're a person completely opposed to profiles, that's fine, but I'm going to show you how to make your own profiles, and I think you might find that maybe some of the artistic ones you don't appeal to. You might be able to find that there's certain things you could create by creating your own profiles that lean into the aesthetic of how you imagine your own film stocks looking, your own foundation being built. So I don't think you need to necessarily avoid these, even if they seem a little bit more creatively out there than you're comfortable with. Again, it's just like choosing the film. There's lots of options, lots of opportunities, so we can play with that, and I think it's a great opportunity to do that. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and collapse these back down. These are all the profiles that are installed, and you see I've got a lot of different options in here. We've got ones that I've created for the Summit already. We've got some that Matt Kloskowski has sold, so these are actually ones that were purchased. You can install them, and we'll walk through how to do that here in a little bit. But this is where all your profiles live. Now, in the workflow, you'll notice that the profile is at the top of the basic panel. And again, if we think about working top down, that's I think a logical workflow that makes sense, but selecting that profile at the top of the basic panel is telling us this is important. Whatever you select here is going to affect how you're going to use the slider bars down below. So select that profile as early in your workflow as possible. In my own workflow, it's one of the first things that gets done after some basic, lens profile correction. I do a little bit of sharpening. I might adjust the exposure a little bit if I was significantly under or overexposed. But again, that little subtle change there, and then I select the profile. Now, just to reiterate the importance of selecting that profile early on, I'm going to jump over here to a different image. So this is an image at sunset, and you can see it looks relatively, a little bit underexposed because I had to make a decision. They're exposed for the sky or exposed for the foreground. But I just want to show you in these profiles, if I come down and let's take a look at some of these maybe modern profiles. If you just watch the foreground, look at how much brighter the foreground is in these images because they're resetting how the black point's defined and how shadow points are defined. And so again, if I'm making decisions about how bright or dark an image should be, in some cases, the profile can do that lift for me, can make a more natural looking aesthetic or a more interesting looking aesthetic than potentially moving the sliders. And because they have no impact on the sliders, I still have the full flexibility of that option. So I'm going to jump back to our image we were working on before. Now, the other piece about selecting the profile that I think is really worth diving into a little bit because it's the creative control aspect. There's this amount slider up here. And you can see right now I'm on the profile Adobe Landscape and I can't adjust the amount. And that's because there are certain profiles, they're either DCP files, they're not the enhanced profiles, or they're profiles where the amount slider has been restricted for some reason. But what the amount slider is analogous to the opacity slider on a layer in Photoshop if you could kick the opacity up higher or lower. So it's going to swing the amount of the effect of the profile on your image. And to me, this is a really cool part of the creative control we can get by working with the images. Because remember, a lot of these enhanced profiles are using those 3D color lookup tables. They're adjusting the colors. They're changing the actual way the colors are rendered in the image. And maybe I want to change and alter the strength of that. Maybe I like it, but it's too strong or not. So this is where it really, I think, gets kind of interesting. So I'm going to come down here and let's choose one of my images that's got a little bit more punch to it. So let's see if we come down here. So here's a 70s throwback profile I created. So if you've looked at old, I call it 70s throwback because of the photo albums looking back in the 70s, 80s, that had color photographs, they faded over time. That's because of the chemical process or whatever. But they kind of get this kind of orangey look to them. So I wanted to create this sort of look and aesthetic to that. So I created a profile that kind of simulates that by creating a lookup table that pushes everything towards orange. But up here, you'll notice the amount. And because this is a enhanced profile or a creative profile, I can adjust the amount of the effect. So if I come back down to 0, none of the effect is applied. And as I slowly drag to the right, you'll see that warmth slowly comes in. So now this starts to look more like kind of sunrise, sunset light. And then eventually I get up and I get to the strength of my filter. And then if I keep going, I'm increasing the strength of that. Now you'll notice that's also causing some other luminance change and things like that. But now I've got this really orange image because I've doubled the effect of the original profile that's been applied. So there's a lot of really great creative control in here for these filters because we can adjust the amount. So if I choose this black and white blue one, this image was created to create a black and white aesthetic, but I could hint just a tiny little bit of blue into that, or I can make it really blue. So the amount slider is really, I think, a great creative control for how you use these profiles. And I think that's one of the things when we talk about the magic of profiles is not only is it remapping the colors, not only is it creating this great foundation, not only is it allowing us to express our creativity, but we also have the control to dial in the strength of the effect we want. We're not stuck with just whatever was created when the profile was created. We have that variability there. And the other piece around that is this particular feature is also available in Lightroom CC. So if you're working in Lightroom CC, if I come back in here and let's go ahead and choose a modern and let's choose modern 3, here's the amount slider there. And you can see I get to dial in the effect of the amount slider in that case. So I get to create that same process whether I'm on my phone, my tablet, on my desktop. That same piece of technology exists everywhere. So I've got that creative control anywhere in my existing workflow. So I think one of the amazing things Adobe's done is to make sure that works all the way around the entire experience. Now, jumping back into Lightroom CC, we're going to cover a couple other things, and then we're going to jump into making our own profiles. So the first thing I want to do is, in here, there's a couple of options you can do for organizing yourself a little bit. Most of the organization for profiles has to be done in Camera Raw, and the creation of profiles has to be done in Camera Raw. There's no way to create a profile inside of Lightroom or inside of Lightroom Classic. It's all done in Camera Raw. But while we're in here inside Lightroom, I can right-click out here in my profile browser. I can delete a profile group. So in this case, I could decide to delete this Lightroom Summit profile group. And if I do that, it's going to delete all the profiles that are contained in there as well. I could expand or collapse all those. This is kind of like solo mode. I could, or in the normal panels, I could expand or collapse all my panels. I could manage profiles. And if I manage profiles, all that's going to let me do is turn on or off different profile settings. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the Lightroom Summit. If I click save, you can see Lightroom Summit has now, if I collapse all these, you can see Lightroom Summit has been removed. If I right click on anywhere on those panels again and choose manage profiles, I can check that box and bring those profiles back. So if you have profiles you sort of use or don't use, that's a way to hide and remove those. I can also delete a profile inside of here. So here I have one that's simulating a film stock. I can right click, I can choose delete profile. I will delete the profile and then it's gone from Lightroom and from Camera Raw. And if you buy profiles or somebody gives you a profile, somebody's created a profile for you to import, in the bonus materials, I've got a couple of profiles for you to practice importing with. You can import profiles that way. But in this case, what I'm going to do is show you how to import profiles in both Lightroom Classic and in Lightroom CC. So in Lightroom Classic, what I'm going to do is go up to the File menu, and about halfway down, you'll see Import, Develop, and Profiles and Presets. So when I select that, it's going to go ahead and take me out, and I get to pick where my profiles are actually stored that I want to import. So in this case, I'm going to come out here, and I've got some of them. Like I said, Matt has got a number of profiles for this, so I just went ahead and downloaded a set of his profiles. In this case, I'm going to grab 4 Seasons. And let's just go on ahead and grab all of the 4 Seasons profiles that Matt created. I select those and I go ahead and click on Import. Development profiles will now be imported into Lightroom Classic, and they will also show up in Camera Raw. And you can see over here now is the Matt K 4 Seasons profiles. And if I click in there, you can see I've got the different profiles that have been installed. Now, if I don't want those inside my Lightroom anymore, I looked at those and I said I want those removed. I can just right click, I can delete the profile group, and those profiles will disappear. So that way we get them imported and get removed. Now, if I'm in Lightroom CC, again, I just go ahead and go up to the File menu, and there's an option for Import Profiles and Presets. And again, in this case, I'll go on ahead and click on Desktop, Profiles, Mats. In this case, I'm going to grab the black and white profiles. Well, let's actually grab the landscape profiles. In this case, I only want to grab a couple of them. So I select the ones that I want to grab. I go on ahead and click Import. It now imports those profiles, which will now appear in Lightroom CC. And there's the landscape ones. And again, those are the options for those. Oh, my puppies never looked better than under day to night profile. So dreamy state. So again, come in and picking whichever one you want. Slider amount adjustment. Everything works just like we described before. But that's the process of getting profiles into Lightroom CC and Lightroom Classic. Now, what about creating profiles? What about making our own profiles? And how do we get this sort of aesthetic where, if I come down here and we look at this fall sunrise, you can see, look at the sky change. So you can see that in this particular piece, Matt's built a color lookup table that shifts blues towards purple. So there's a lot of flexibility here, but how do we get to that? And what if I don't want to make anything that crazy? Or what if I want to make something more crazy than that? So let's jump into Camera Raw now and figure out how to do this. Okay, so we're here inside of Photoshop. Document open as a smart object. I'm going to go ahead and double click on the smart object, open the Camera Raw. Now you could do this whether you were activating through Bridge, however you get into Camera Raw, it doesn't really matter. You've got to be in Camera Raw for this to work. So I'm in Camera Raw now, and here you can see I've got my profiles. I've got that same set of profiles that I had inside of Lightroom. There's Matt's landscape ones, there's my black and white film ones, there's the Lightroom Summit we looked at. To create a profile, what you do is you click on where the More Image Settings option is. You're going to hold down the Alt key on a PC or the Option key on a Mac, and you're going to click on that menu, and Create Profile will appear in the middle there. If you don't click on Alt or Option, you'll see Create Preset. So that's how you know you've missed the keyboard shortcut. If you're looking for creating profiles and you click on that menu and you don't see it, remember you've got to hold down that Alt or Option key. Once that appears, we've now got the Create Profile dialog box. So this is where we can set all of the settings for creating a profile. I'm going to walk through the basics of these settings, and then we're going to go back and create several different profiles using these various options. But I want to give you kind of a high-level overview of the dialog box first. At the top is where we name our profile. So you'll see me name different profiles. We'll call them something that we think is appropriate. Descriptive names are good here. If you keep it Untitled 1, Untitled 2, Untitled 3, it's very difficult to figure out what the profile did. So we want some kind of process to figure out what that is by the name. The group is what group does it live in. So here you can see I could create a new group, or I've got some existing groups already created. The current image settings to include, these are the settings that were from Camera Raw. So one of the cool things we can do is we can use some of the settings that were in Camera Raw to define our profile. So things from the basic panel, the curves panel, whether you're using a parametric or a point curve, HSL settings. If you're doing a black and white monochrome profile, you could use the black and white sliders. Color grading. So the color grading panel, you can apply some basic level of color grading into the image. Again, not as advanced as a 3D lookup, but you could still actually create that. Vignettes, you could apply a post-crop vignette or the impact of some of the gradient filters. I would recommend you really think long and hard about the gradient filters, because the profile doesn't create a gradient. The gradient that you apply to an image, let's say like you do the sky, you drop down, you make the sky really dark, and you make the exposure on that -4, so it goes to almost pure black. And then you apply that profile on a portrait you did. That pure black sky you created would make all of the pixels in the portrait that dark, but has no awareness that it wasn't a sky, has no awareness that you were trying to make a gradient to impact just the sky. It applies that level to those pixels, because remember, a profile is at the foundation. So those pixels aren't a gradient that you then adjust later. They are resetting the value of those pixels when the pixels are interpreted by Lightroom at the very beginning of the process. So I would recommend, if you've got gradients you're using, that those might be better served as a preset, but you do have the option for creating them here. You might create them because maybe you are doing some kind of landscape work, or you're going to darken edges or something like that. But again, I would use those with extreme caution. The middle section is tone mapping. And so this is similar to an HDR effect. The default is low, which is what Lightroom does normally with an image. But you can select medium or high. And what this does is where you have the sliders inside of Lightroom for contrast, the black, the white, the highlight, shadow, those are actually will allow a more aggressive adjustment in the strength of the effect of those tools, because we're actually going to map a little bit more aggressive tonal value into the image. It works great. It kind of has that HDR effect to it. I would say for most profiles, you're better off being at low and normal so that you end up with a much more natural look. But sometimes maybe you're creating a monochrome and you want that really robust ability to create that higher contrast. That might be an opportunity to go medium or high, but it's something you would want to experiment and test with on your own profiles just to see how the effect was. The look table is the base bucket for how color is defined inside of the profile. And Adobe Color is the default profile by which raw files are read to. So when you open Lightroom, if you don't assign anything during import or anything like that, it'll default to Adobe Color. You can create your own look tables. So you can actually write your own look tables. We're not going to cover that particular aspect of in this class, but you can select a look table to use. Now, where did this decision for Adobe Color come from? That comes from the profile you have selected in the image when you opened up the profile editor. So if I cancel out of this and I come back and look at my profiles, I'm set for Adobe Color. But if I say change that to Adobe Vivid and come back in to my Create Profile, you can now see the look table as Adobe Vivid. It's using the existing information to define the starting point for that look table. And that look table's job is to set, again, how those base colors are interpreted. Now, the last section is the color lookup table. So this is the application of one of those 3D color LUTs that changes the look and the aesthetic of an image. So we change the colors by that remapping value. So that's the options we have inside Create Profile. So let's go on ahead and now make some profiles and look at how to apply those. But before we do that, I think we should look a little bit more about a color lookup table and how that actually works in an image. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel out here of Camera Raw, and I've got that image we were looking at before of the desert cactus. In Photoshop, we have the option of applying a LUT. We can actually create LUTs inside of Photoshop as well, which again is outside the scope of this course. But to do that, what I'm going to do is go to make an adjustment layer called Color Lookup. And when I do that, I get the Color Lookup adjustment layer, and at the top option is a 3D LUT file. And there are several defaults inside of Photoshop. So I could come down here and I could choose Late Sunset. And you can see it's remapped the colors of this image to make them kind of this magenta orange color. If I choose Moonlight, they're going to map into a blue characteristic, a blue quality. If I choose a soft warming, you can see they've got a little bit of red comes in there, a little bit of orange, a little bit of yellow comes in there to warm up. If I choose teal orange, you can see that a lot of the oranges have gone a little bit more orange, and the greens and the blues have shifted a little bit towards teal. So we can actually see that teal start to show up in the sky. So the 3D lookup table is about manipulating the colors, and there's a lot of great tools for that. There's 3D LUT Creator. There's lots of tools that create 3D LUTs for you. And I think it's really, if you're going to get into that work, one of those tools can help with that. The other piece about LUTs creation, and I'll give you in the bonus material a file that'll help with that. But as you can see in here, there's all sorts of colors that change based on this LUT. And sometimes working an image is really hard to understand how the LUT behaves because not necessarily all those colors are in that LUT or in that image for the LUT. So sometimes a real basic color file can help with that. So I provided that in the bonus materials as well if you're going to kind of create your own LUTs as a potential starting point. In Photoshop, though, let's say like you decided you liked this, late sunset look as a LUT. You said, I really like that color mapping. You can then come up to go File, Export, and then you can export a lookup table. So in here is the description, which is the text description for the actual LUT. And Lightroom and Camera Raw only see a grid point of 32, so you don't need to create anything bigger than that. So a 32, and you do need to make a cube file out of it. You then export the actual lookup table, and then you could use that when you import into your own profiles that you're creating. Okay, so back to our actual image we're going to create our profiles out of. And again, this is a base image. It's a little bit underexposed. I don't worry about that when I'm creating the profile necessarily because I'm, again, building that foundation, but I just have the image open. A well-exposed image, a good evenly exposed image is a nicer place to start from, but I'm going to show you in a second why I chose this image. Let's go ahead and go back into Camera Raw. And what we're going to do now is we're going to make a very basic adjustment profile. And so what I'm going to use is just some of the basic panels and some of the actual options that we have inside of Camera Raw. So one of the first things I want to do is I want to add a little bit of clarity and a little bit of texture to an image. So I want to make sure there's just a little bit of crunch in a landscape image. I would actually have that in there. And I also want the image to actually be a little bit more saturated. So I'm going to boost the saturation of this profile. I also am going to go into the linear curve adjustment. And one of the things I want to do is I don't want to have a hard black. I want to actually have this kind of have a more soft black, a little bit softer quality to the deep shadows. So I'm going to raise that black point. And that's why I chose this image, because I wanted to see from an image that's a little bit underexposed, kind of what is that level of change. But I do want the contrast to be in there. So I want to go ahead and actually put a little bit of a contrast curve back into that. So I've got just a little bit of a dip there to kind of create a little bit of contrast. I'm also going to go in here into my HSL panel, and I want to make sure that my blues actually drift a little bit towards the kind of aqua. I want my aquas to go a little there. And then I also am going to take my oranges, or my reds, and I want to push them a little bit to orange and make my oranges a little bit towards red. So I'm just going to make that adjustment for this particular set of adjustments for the file. Now I hold down that Alt or Option key and I select Create Profile. When I do that, you can see that Point Curve and the HSL adjustments in the basic panel all had adjustments made to them. So this is asking me, do you want to include all of these inside of my profile? And do I want to include the look table for Adobe Color? Now I could select no look table, in which case these settings are what would define the initial look of the color. So in this case, I'm going to create this, my basic profile. So I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to put that in, just leave that in my user's profile. So I go ahead and click OK. And then let's go on ahead and do a reset of my image. And now if I come to Browse, down here at the bottom will be my user profiles. And then there's my basic profile I created. So there you can see the adjustments created by that profile. And I can again dial in that strength of those. And you can see by going to 200%, if I mouse over what should be pure black, you can see that my RGB value in the histogram is at about 45. That's the deepest black that can be created. So if I even printed this, the deepest black would be that 45. It might be an interesting way for me to look at the photograph if I'm working particularly with like a black and white image or something like that, or I'm doing an image where I want a softer feel to it. You're doing portrait work where you want a little bit softer quality. That might be interesting. Or you could reverse it, create a really deep black, and you end up with this little bit more gritty, harsh environment. Either way, that's the option for you for creating the profile. That's one of the nice parts about creating the profile. But this gives me kind of a nice, interesting starting point. Now I'm going to go back up here to Camera Raw. In this case, I'm going to choose, say, Adobe Vivid, and as my starting point for my profile. And in this case, we're just going to make a little bump again into clarity and texture into the basic panel. And then I kind of want a little bit brighter whites. So I'm just going to brighten the whites. Go to Profile. I'm going to go to Create Profile. And in this case, I'm going to leave the color lookup table selected. And I'm going to call this, let's call it my Vivid Profile. Again, I'll leave that under User Profiles. In this case, basic panel is done. I don't want to include anything that was adjusted in the point curve. And I'll go ahead and click OK. And now that profile has been created. So if I come over here, oops, not create profile. If I come over here and do a reset on my default, and again, come into my browser at the very bottom down here, I've got now my Vivid profile. So that would be my starting point. There was my basic one. There's my Vivid. You can see there's a difference in there again about how those images would start. Now let's go ahead and add in that last piece about the color lookup table. So I'm going to go ahead and let's do a basic reset here again. And I'm on Adobe Color. I'll go ahead and do forgot to hold down that Option key, hold down Create Profile. Now in this case, I'm going to do this is going to be my teal green effect. So I'm going to apply a color lookup table at this point. So in this case, no adjustments at all. I'm going to use the lookup table for Adobe Color to define the base colors, and then the color lookup table is going to make its modifications based on the Adobe Color. That's the default. So I'm going to go ahead and load this. And again, down here, I can specify the minimum, the amount, the default amount, and the maximum. Now you can change those values. It might be that this is just too aggressive for you. This lookup table is just going to be too much. So you could come in and adjust these. So I could come in and say, well, I want the default strength to start at 75, and I want the max strength to be at 150. So I can come in and modify again after the fact, or not after the fact, I can modify during the creation, how much range do I want to have for that slider bar to actually create. Now, what's important down here when you apply a color lookup table is, again, the sample points that were created when the image was created. The clipping, or the gamut here is for clipping or extend, and this is just like a rendering intent when you print. If the color is out of the gamut of the color lookup table, does it just clip the color, or should it try to extend and interpolate what that color should be based on the actual colors that were existing? You'll have to experiment a little bit with this, because in some cases, one or the other might produce an unwanted, undesired effect. So checking with both. I'm going to go ahead and leave this one for clip. And then what was the color space that the actual LUT was created in? So in this case, this one happened to be created in ProPhoto. So I'm going to select ProPhoto for that. And I go ahead and click OK. And it's now created my teal green. Okay, we reset that image. Come back into my profile, and down here at the bottom under user profiles, you can see there's that teal green, and there we get the effect of that LUT being applied into the image. Now let's say like I really decide that a couple of these profiles I've created I really like. Well, if we come back here to this profile menu, you can see there's that option for color, landscape, color vivid, monochrome, and then the profile I'm in. That pull-down menu are actually favorites. Those are the favorite profiles I use all the time, over and over again. So now that I've created a couple of profiles, I'm going to go ahead and say that I really like this My Vivid profile. So on that star in the upper right-hand corner, I'm going to click on that. That makes it a favorite, which means it'll be in that pull-down list. So again, some of the ones I created earlier for this, say like I like this black and white one, I can make that a favorite. And I like in the artistic one, I kind of like Artistic 4. I decided I really like that. So now when I come back to my profiles, you can see that I've got my favorite profile, Artistic 4, Landscape, Color, Vivid. Now I could decide maybe I don't like Adobe Vivid. To get rid of a favorite, I just come up here into the Adobe Raw ones. There is Adobe Vivid. I just uncheck that as a favorite. It goes away, and now it's actually out of my favorite profiles. Now that's going to be that way in Lightroom or in here. You can change the profiles back and forth, or the favorites back and forth, either way in the programs. Okay, so I've created some profiles now. I've got them all set up. Let's jump back into Lightroom. Let's go into Classic here, and let's go select one of those profiles. Well, I go to Browse, and I come down to User Profiles, and I am missing those profiles I just created. So one of the things about profiles is they're only created, or they're only activated upon launching of Lightroom. It reads the profiles when it starts. So if you're missing profiles you've created, go ahead and quit Lightroom. When you quit Lightroom, then go ahead and restart it. And then when you restart it, you'll then see those profiles appear inside of the profile browser. It drives me a little crazy sometimes because I'll forget, and I'll come back into Lightroom expecting to see those profiles I created. And there's the teal green piece we just created. So I have the option of creating it here. It drove me a little crazy because I would forget that I needed to restart. So that's just one thing to look at there. Now, organizationally, the other thing about creating profiles is this could run amok in a hurry. This could get absolutely crazy if you're creating a bunch of profiles. And then you can also see how there's a little bit of nice organization over here where these lines have been broken up to actually include profiles in these little grouped folders. So let's jump back into Camera Raw and look at how do we deal with organization of our profiles. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the profile browser, and this profile, this teal green one, what I'm going to do is right click on that, and here's some of the things I can do inside of Camera Raw to manage my profiles. I can get profile info, which will just give me some of the basic information about the profile. If I add to favorites, adds it to favorite, I can rename the profile. So if I choose rename profile, it'll let me change that. And I say teal green, I actually want that to say teal green and orange. O-R-A-N-G-E. And I actually can click OK there, and you can see it's now changed the name of that profile. I can move a profile. So in this case, I've got this profile inside of my user profile. If I move profile, it will let me select a different group to put it in. So I'm going to say, I want this one in my black and white films profile group. So if I select that, it now appears inside of black and white films. So I can move things around. If I reset favorite profiles, go back to the default reset for Lightroom or for Camera Raw, and then I can import from here as well. But if I hold down the Alt key or the Option key when I choose rename profiles, when I do that, I get the rename advanced mode, when this is where all the good stuff happens. So in here, again, I'll walk through the dialog box real fast, then we'll go ahead and talk about applying them. The name is the actual name of the profile. The group is what group does it sit in. These are the groups over here. So there's the ones I'm in control of, Negative Lab Pro, which is a group created for my other class, which is about DSLR scanning, and at the core of that is profiles. So we'll talk about profiles a lot in that class as well. But those are the two groups. I could create a new group to include it in. So if I choose a new group, and I call this my group of good stuff. And it will then create a group over here titled my group of good stuff. A cluster is the grouping of these. So you can see here the lines that are over here that break up the organization. The cluster is to put them into that cluster so that I could have multiple profiles within that same little logical organization group. We'll come back to look at that for the Lightroom Summit here in a second. The short name is the abbreviated name for this profile. Teal, green, and orange is a long name that might be difficult to see if you're on a mobile device. And so I could shorten that name up to TGO, and that would actually then appear as a short name of TGO. When you mouse over it, you'd see the longer name. So again, the descriptive name can be shortened so it appears on the phone or other device. A sort name is what order to go in. So it's an alphanumeric sort. So I could put in a number 1 there, and it would appear first in my list. So you've got a little control about what appears at the top or the bottom inside the organization of there. Description is to give a description of what the profile does. This is important, I think, if you're making complicated profiles or if you're going to be selling profiles or giving profiles away. A little description there is nice to have. Copyright is where you could put in your copyright information. So I could say, well, this is my actual profile. So I'll just put my name in there. I could put in my contact information. So if I could actually type in my email address. So I put in my email address there, and that would appear in the profile information. Now, this section at the bottom is one of the most kind of important sections. This defines how and when the profile can be used. So the model decides, does it work with all images, JPEGs, RAW files, PNGs, TIFF files? Does it only work with images that have an Adobe standard profile, basically meaning it's a RAW file? Or does it limit it to RAW files that have a Nikon Z7 DCP profile? So maybe I'm doing something to really enhance something specific with this Nikon camera. I could build profiles that are very targeted to that. They would only show up if I was on a Nikon Z7 image. Type is, does it work for RAW, non-RAW, just RAW, or just non-RAW images? Now, one of the things that can trip you up here is if you choose, say, images with standard Adobe profiles and then select non-RAW images, well, a JPEG's not ever going to have that standard profile. Remember in Lightroom CC, we looked at the puppy dog and we only had color and monochrome under the basic because it was a JPEG. It's not going to get that profile applied. So if you make a setting in here where all of a sudden your profile is not showing up where you expect it, this applicability is the place to come and check and make sure that the settings in here are correct. And even if you've just created the profile and it's not showing up as you would expect, come and check here first before you kind of recreate the profile over and over again, hoping something magical will happen. In this case, I'm going to do raw and non-raw images and images for all models of cameras. You can make the decision of whether it works for color and monochrome images or just color or just monochrome images. And then you can decide if it works for all normal images and then HDR images or just HDR images or just normal images. An HDR image in this case is an image that has had a photo merge applied to it inside of Lightroom. So you end up with the HDR.dng version of the file. So that would be applied to that. And then does it support the actual use of the slider bar? So that's the basic pieces that are in there. So we've done a little chunk of work in here on this teal, green, and orange profile. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now you can see what I've got is a new group over here called My Group of Good Stuff. And in there is that one profile. There's the short name. If I mouse over it, you get the long name. Now, if I come up here to Lightroom Summit and click on Rename Profile, bring up that dialog box, you'll see that the cluster is titled LS1 for Lightroom Summit 1. And there's a short name of 1 there for that BW&B profile that was created. That cluster of LS1 is all I need to add to any one of my profiles to get it to be included in that cluster. So if I come down to My Group of Good Stuff, right-click on that, hold down Alt-Option again, and I add that to the cluster LS1 and click OK. So I've added it to that Lightroom Summit group, cluster. You can see that the actual group has been moved from the default area down here up into that same cluster that's up here. So there's the Lightroom Summit, and which is a group inside the cluster, and there's My Group of Good Stuff, which is also a group inside the cluster. Now, if I wanted this image to actually appear inside the Lightroom Summit, all I have to do is right-click on that. And if I wanted to appear actually in the Lightroom Summit group that exists, I've got to do a couple of things. First thing I got to do is I got to create it in a group called Lightroom Summit. So even though the group already exists, I've got to put it into a new group because the cluster defines the group. Then I put the cluster in as LS1, and then when I click OK, if I come up to my Lightroom Summit, you'll see that the group is there. So it's a little weird there to do the create a new group of the name of the group that already exists, but that way it gets it into the cluster. And then you can keep your profiles organized and set up. So I'll go ahead and click OK there. Let's jump back into Lightroom. If I wanted to import those profiles that I created myself into Lightroom CC, because remember, in Lightroom Classic, I just restart and they appear there. But if I want to actually import them into Lightroom CC, if I go up to Import Profiles, I have to go to the default location for where the profiles exist when they're created, and I've put that up on the screen for both Mac and PC. But in this case, I'll go ahead and go to Library, Application Support, Adobe, Camera Raw, Settings, and then here you can see is that list of profiles, and including down here is that teal, green, and orange. So we select that. Oh, here we go. It's Lightroom Summit. There's my TGO, teal, green, and orange. And you can see it actually did a good job of turning my sky pretty teal in that process. So that's the way to get those profiles you just created into Lightroom CC. They'll need to be imported because it won't go read them out off by default. Okay, so that takes care of what are profiles, where did they come from, when do we use them. Doesn't matter if you're doing color, black and white. Remember, a black and white image has got a black and white profile applied to it. It's that foundational piece we use for really kind of establishing how the photograph is going to look and the aesthetic it's going to use. If you haven't played with the existing profiles that are there, I would encourage you to just look at what's there. Even if you don't create your own, just take a look and see what it affords you in terms of your understanding of editing the images. The other thing about profiles that I think is worth mentioning that I think really helps you become a better photographer is understanding what the profile is doing to your image. And imagine if you look at Vintage 6, what was done to create that profile? How are the colors changed? How is contrast changed? How are the tones changed? And even if you just try to figure out what was done, it's going to help make you a better editor by understanding how profiles are created and the impact they have on those foundational pixels. Makes you understand some of the decisions you might make as a photographer in editing your own work. Thanks again for joining me and have a great rest of the summit.